Hello, welcome to a new installment of SPC Conversations. SPC is Solidarity with the Persecuted Church, a charity that is devoted to supporting, aiding persecuted Christian communities around the world. And my name is Greg Roos. I served on the board of SPC, and I am delighted to have with us today Professor Robert Destro. Professor Destro is a dear, dear friend, and hello, Bob.
Hey, how are you, Greg? Thanks for having me.
Well, it's really wonderful to have you join us. I look at your many, many years of extraordinary service to the country in so many different ways, and it really is a fascinating biography, but also a fascinating testament to how people can make a difference. Bob, you are a scholar, a diplomat, and advocate. You serve as professor at Catholic University of America's Law School, Columbus School of Law, and you have this extraordinary career in and out of government. And perhaps one of the ways to go through our discussion is to talk about those different roles and then talk about the issues that you've had to deal with and what you feel the problems are today that we can help in terms of persecuted Christians around the world. Your last government service was as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And you served with us in this capacity, I guess, for about 2 years. And in that capacity, you oversaw the State Department's worldwide policy and foreign assistance programs on human rights, democracy, including free and fair elections, internet freedom, the growth of the surveillance state, and religious freedom. And so perhaps we can begin by talking a little bit about that role and the kinds of things that you saw regarding the issue of Christians and how they are treated in some hotspots in the world.
Well, I think I'd like to start with how Christians are treated in not hot spots. Okay, and how they're treated generally. And if you think about the current discussion about people talking about things like Christian nationalism, right? That somehow Christians are perceived to be a threat. And of course, then Christians come, as you know, in many different denominational flavors. But Christianity itself is viewed as a threat to a bunch of different kind of philosophical and cultural traditions out there. And so I'll give you an example. In the State Department, you begin to realize that they view human rights issues a little bit like the Great Society, where it's more like a social welfare program than it is like diplomacy. And the goal is to go out there and try and meet the needs and mainstream people who are, quote, marginalized. Okay, now the definition of marginalized basically means, from a religious point of view, anybody who's not Christian. So Christians are viewed as the ruling class, so to speak, today. And there are very, very large forces arrayed against them. And so that's why I wanted to start with the not, kind of not in the global South. So by the time you get to Christians in Iraq or Christians in Libya, or Christians in Nigeria, it's like they're all defined as being oppressors. And so it's not that they deserve what they got, but there's a hint of that in there.
That's very interesting. And as you know, because of a law that was passed in 1998, the International Religious Freedom Act, the issue of religious freedom was thrust purposely by Congress in a bipartisan way, a Democrat president, Republican-controlled Congress, into the official agenda of the State Department diplomacy. And that's now about 25 years ago. And it's been a spotty record in terms of how well that has actually succeeded at including religious freedom in the agenda of foreign aid, diplomacy, strategic planning, all the things that the United States does around the world. As you know, I served in the Defense Department as the lead DoD official overseeing the military training and cooperation and aid programs, including what we submitted to the State Department for assistance. And there's so many different agendas that are involved in foreign policy aid. There's US strategic considerations, military, alliances, all sorts of things. And religious freedom, and I would say human rights in general, is there now, but in some sense it can be brought in or brought out depending on the decision making that happens. And so in your position as Assistant Secretary of State overseeing all of these human rights related programs, how hard was it to get religious freedom to be included in the concern, and also specifically the issue of persecuted Christians in, for example, our relationship with countries like Nigeria, Iraq, around the world?
Well, to sum it up briefly, it was like pulling teeth. Now, you have to understand as well that within the State Department, the Religious Freedom Office was split off from my bureau, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And so my colleague, Senator Sam Brownback, was the ambassador for international religious freedom. We worked together quite a bit, but the way in which the reaction we got when we tried to get security assistance to the persecuted Christian communities in places like Iraq and Nigeria was extreme pushback. I mean that we would never, for example, have obtained the genocide declaration that we got in 2016 for the persecuted Christians and Yazidis in Iraq because of ISIS, if it had only been the Christians.
Let's actually dig in a little bit into the issue of Nigeria and what's happening there, what you observed in terms of how things are really in a dire straits for Christians. It's one of the real, and again, now we're talking about hotspots, one of the real hotspot of Christian persecution around the world. And talk a little bit about what's happening there, your own experience in trying to deal with it, and what you are suggesting should be done about Nigeria. SPC is launching an initiative. Actually, we're going to be sending a team to Nigeria in order to investigate and provide support through the local church, which is what we do at SPC. So tell me a little bit about Nigeria from your experience and observation.
Well, there's a lot of history involved with Nigeria, but let's start with geography. The northern Nigeria is a huge country. It will probably be the third most populous country in the world by 2050. It's got about 230 million people right now. And in the north, it's actually quite a large country. It would, if you actually try to superimpose it on the map, it would take up much of the eastern United States. And so the northern part of the country is predominantly Muslim and borders on what they call the Sahel region. Kind of sub-Saharan Africa. The South is predominantly Christian, and the middle of the country, which they actually call the Middle Belt, is mixed. And Nigeria is a huge country. It's got about 90 languages. It's got, an extraordinary number of ethnic groups. Each one has its unique culture, its unique language, but religion often unites them. And so in the north, the dominant religion is Islam. And in the middle, you have kind of a combination of Christians and kind of native indigenous religions like animism. And when Nigeria received its independence from the British, the British did what the British often do, which is play divide and conquer. And so they basically set set it up so that they pitted the Christians and the Muslims against each other. And so if you take that combination and you've got a country which is dominated by the Muslim North, and the federal administration in Abuja is predominantly Muslim, and the country traditionally has seesawed between Christian presidents and a Muslim vice president, and then a Muslim president, and a Christian vice president. I think we're losing that now. And so you've got an overt dominance of the Muslim political philosophy, and basically the Christians are getting pushed out. Now I think the State Department is somewhat right when they say, well, it's cultural, it's competition for land. Well, yeah, that's partly true. But if I'm trying to do a land grab, which is exactly what's going on, I might wipe out the farmers and push them off their land, but I don't attack their churches. And in Nigeria, they're attacking the churches during Mass, during services in the Protestant communities. They're attacking the churches specifically. So you basically have the worst of all possible worlds. You have corrupt, not secure, religiously motivated violence, where they push the people off the land and then give the contract to the Chinese to go mine it. So, it's not a good situation, to say the least. And one of the things I love about your upcoming trip is that you're actually going to go sit down with the people on the ground and say, okay, how can we help you?
Yeah, and working through the local churches, as you know, is an extraordinarily important way to do this, because the way that U.S. aid programs operate is they typically operate through NGOs, through the United Nations system, and the aid is basically going around the community leaders that are such glue historically for these communities, going back as long as there had been Christian communities in these areas. And it's always striking in places like Iraq and Syria, where the Christian communities are 1,900 years old or older, back to the time of the apostles. There seems to be a unawareness or unwillingness to realize that when you're undercutting these leaders who understand their community, the pastors, the priests, the ministers, you end up actually creating even greater disruption and dislocation in these communities, and they lose the resilience that they have had to be in these places. Nigeria in particular is a concern for all of us. What do you recommend in terms of how to assist Christians in Nigeria in general, not only through U.S. government action or inaction, but also through other support?
Well, I think that one of the most important things is to get the word out among the American Christian communities. American Christians, whether they're Catholics or evangelical or mainline Protestants, they don't understand Eastern Christianity, and they certainly don't understand African Christianity. And so one anecdote is that an evangelical friend asked a Chaldean bishop in Iraq, so when did you first meet Jesus? To which his response was, when St. Thomas introduced us to him 2,000 years ago. Okay, so that's kind of the evangelical community doesn't really quite understand the Orthodox community. Okay, the same thing though is true with respect to the Catholic community. That the Catholic community is very top down as well. It's a hierarchical church. And so the American Catholic bishops can't engage with people on the ground because they have to go through the local bishops' conference. And so when you and Steve Wagner, and others go over to visit, you're kind of breaking a mold. You're actually starting from the bottom up, which is a great thing to do. And of course, meeting with pastors, Christian pastors, kind of evangelical or Protestant pastors, there's no hierarchy that you have to hold hands with. In the Catholic community, you not only have to meet with the pastors, you have to meet with the local bishops. And as the local bishops have told me on many occasions, don't come in here trying to help us without talking to us first, because you don't really know what it's like to live here.
That's right.
And that's a really pretty profound statement if you really think about it, because 90% of Nigerians' greatest fear is that they'll be kidnapped for ransom. So they live in a really dangerous neighborhood. And so the question, how do we help them, is really, you have to start at the local level and work up.
Right. And as you remember, and we worked together on this issue at great length when ISIS was committing its depredations after the Arab Spring, the extent to which people didn't understand these Eastern churches, and they're Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic. And when you actually go there, the Catholic hierarchy is constantly interacting with the Orthodox hierarchy in these various churches. There's a real dialogue of sorts happening, and a cooperative dialogue in a very difficult position, given the fact that Christians are a minority and they don't often have much political ability and autonomy. And yet they survived for 1,500 years in very difficult straits. And so there's a lesson to be learned for all of us. And you made a very interesting point about how learning about the Nigerian church, how it works, its relationship with the community that they serve, is really important. And I guess it's validating what we're trying to do at SPC, which is to work through that the clergy, the local churches and their bishops, to make sure that what we're doing actually is supportive and not inconsistent with what they're concerned about. Now I'm going to jump a little bit now geographically. I think a couple of places that we should talk about. One of them is China, because obviously that's a circumstance. Now, interestingly, in your capacity as Assistant Secretary of State, you also were the special rapporteur for Tibet. And of course, in Tibet, we have a Buddhist community that is under terrible straits, a community that goes back thousands of years. And basically, there is a kind of ethnic cleansing of sorts going on, not only towards Tibetans ethnically, but also towards their faith. And one of the things I think that I'd like to hear that we should talk about is this broader issue of religious freedom, and how in places like Tibet, which does not have a significant Christian presence, it matters in some sense the same way that if religious freedom is protected, a society's broader civil liberties and respect for the individual is protected.
Well, yeah, it does, because I think that if you step back a couple of steps and you think of the term culture, the root of the term culture is cult. And so if you look at what makes a culture, it's the religion, its perception of the nature of reality, and its language. So if you lose the religion and you lose the language, then you lose the culture completely. Now, that's what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do. They're taking over the religion, and I'm not going to get into the details of the succession of the Dalai Lama, but basically they want the Dalai Lama to be a bureaucrat. That's precisely what they're doing with respect to the patriotic church in China with respect to Catholics. They want to be able to appoint the bishops or have a say in doing that. And now, of course, over history, the Catholic Church has long consulted local governments about who should be the bishop. I mean, and that, when they appointed the first bishop of Baltimore, John Carroll, they checked through the French government, and Benjamin Franklin and James Madison and those people were all involved in that discussion. And they finally concluded, well, that's your business, that's not our business, because we actually believe in the separation of church and state. Well, countries like China don't. Their religion is the Communist Party. In Tibet, the Dalai Lama is the symbol of the culture. And that's one of the things, if I can kind of come back to Nigeria for just a minute, and that is you have to be aware of the local culture. So how the Christian community is treated in, say, the Southeast, which, people used to know as Biafra, is very, very different than what happens in the Middle Belt, or when you get up to the north in Sokoto, which is predominantly Muslim. So you're going to be dealing with Christian issues up there, much the same way as you would be in Saudi Arabia. So that cultural piece, wiping out the culture or subordinating the culture, is what we often talk about as religious freedom.
Well, and it's striking when you think about China, how in the West there's massive oppression declared as genocide by the United States of the Muslim population in the West, of Turkic ethnic composition. You have what's
Right.
happening in Tibet, and of course you have the attacks on, even semi-independent Christian churches, whether Catholic, Protestant, or other types of Christian denominations. And I guess the point you're making is that it's all par for the course, it's all related, and how you treat each of these religious faiths and their cultures is a sign of a broader issue. And perhaps that is a good window into some things you've also done in your biography I wanted to highlight. And one of them is you're serving several decades ago as a commissioner on the United States Commission on Civil Rights. And you have been, as a scholar, a path breaker in the whole discussion about religious freedom, the need to protect it in the United States, internationally. And one of the things I thought quite interesting, and I would mention, by the way, one of your most important books, and you have an incredible corpus of scholarly writing, is the book that you wrote on religious liberty in a pluralistic society. And I guess I'm inviting you to talk about the commission, what you had to deal with in terms of religious freedom, and helping us understand how domestic religious freedom concerns and international religious freedom concerns are interrelated. And it's all about the nature of society that you would want to live in, where religious expression, religious belief is respected.
Well, it's a George Bush 41, was asked one day, is it, how do you describe things? Is it one thing after another? He goes, no, it's the same damn thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And that's my reaction to that. When I got on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, my interests were primarily religion and culture. Well, as soon as I walked into the Civil Rights Commission, because I had this kind of weird kind of cultural religious thing, I was kind of able to talk to everybody. They also needed my vote because I was the swing vote on many issues. But there were a bunch of really significant problems in Indian country. And so I was looking for people. There were like shootings and reservations and up in northern Wisconsin and Michigan. And so I said, who wants to come out and investigate the civil rights problem with me? And it was like, one hand clapping. I mean, just people weren't interested, because in the end, a lot of this is about cultural control. And in that regard, it's just it's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in intensity between here and there.
Well, and I think, from my perspective, when I was at the Defense Department dealing with all the different issues of concern, always in the back of my mind was an awareness that these kinds of questions, human rights and specifically religious freedom, are touchstones for the success or failure of a society in which there are different ethnic and religious groups. And that's true in the West, it's true in the global South, And you're pointing out very powerfully how the battles that we wage in trying to help persecuted Christians internationally resonate in terms of our own lives here. And that by providing assistance and engaging in the issue of persecution of Christians in places like Nigeria, you're actually working on your own understanding of your own life, your own country, and what is important in terms of freedom and liberty. And I think it's a powerful, powerful statement. And your involvement in both the world of the international diplomatic issues of this and domestically over many years is, I think, a powerful testament to how interconnected all this, and your understanding of this is profound. And I have taken a look at your book, and it is still very, very relevant examination of this issue. And I hope you perhaps someday update it, because
Well, what I did, much to my chagrin, and I think somewhat unfairly to my co-author, I got involved in a bunch of cases and left the revisions to other people. So it has been updated.
oh,
It was really, it was and remains the first major law school textbook on the topic of religious freedom. And the reason we picked the title Religious Liberty in a Pluralistic Society is because in a pluralistic society, you got a lot of competition, right? And so what you want to make sure is that nobody thinks that God died and left them, that God died, that's the atheist point of view, or that God put them in charge. That was the view of the English kings. God died, God put me in charge, and by God, you're all going to be Protestant. Well, what if I don't want to be? So when you look at this, it really is a question of, as an Egyptian friend put it, he says, do you stand with the believers or don't you?
yeah.
And it doesn't matter what kind of believers. Believers have far more in common with one another than they do with the people who don't. The question, what do believers have in common with one another? I wish I could say that I made that I made that up, but the fact is that it came from a good friend who was running for parliament in Egypt. And his primary opponents were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he said he got the idea from his mother. And she says, well, why don't you just say, run on a platform, I stand with the believers. Now, for a lot of people who believe in realpolitik and kind of look at the world in a Machiavellian way, that's kind of say, what are you talking about? Well, the fact is that one of my very good rabbi friends, who actually spoke at Catholic University's graduation this past June, Rabbi Jack Benperan, who runs the Center for Interreligious Understanding, says, look, without the concept of monotheism, there can be no understanding of human rights. Why? Because monotheism posits that there is a supreme God to whom even the king is subordinate. And if you look back at kind of the pagan religions, especially the Greeks and the Romans, it was very capricious. The gods had human characteristics. So if you actually engage with Buddhists and with Muslims and with animists, you name it, they all have this idea that there is a transcendent force. Some call it God, some call it, some say Allah. In fact, Middle Eastern Christians say Allah. I mean, Yahweh and Allah are basically the same root. And so the idea is either I'm in charge as a person and you have to do what I tell you, or God is in charge. And if you can talk to people as I have in the Middle East, in Iran, in India, and you get to the serious thinkers, you walk away thinking, okay, we're made in the image and likeness of God. God gives every single one of us the yearning to find him. And as one of my mentors at Catholic University, who was a philosopher, the late George MacLean, wrote a book called The Shape of the Mountain. It says, in the mountain is God, but your perception of the mountain will depend on where you're standing. Now that doesn't mean that everybody's views are equal. It just means that everybody's viewpoint is valuable because it's their viewpoint, not because you agree with it. And that's the foundation of human rights.
That's beautiful. And very, very profound. And thank you for that. Thank you, Bob, for joining us for this SPC conversation. And thank you for your service to the country and all the work you've been doing to help persecuted Christians around the world.
And thank you, Greg. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Good luck on your trip. Thank you for your service too. I mean, you've done a lot of good work out there in that vineyard. So keep it up, and send me a postcard from Nigeria.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. And talk to you soon.